and Kendra and I worked together for years, kind of creating great brands. So sharing some insights and things that I've kind of paid attention to over the years. But when Kendra and I were talking about this, I kind of thought about it in terms of like two key takeaways. I always kind of think of like, if you remember nothing else, remember this. This idea of like what makes a good brand, balancing these two things, the idea of intent and then the idea of the environment in terms of brand. And so what I mean by when I talk about intent is really thinking about like what's that character of the brand, what's the aspiration of the brand. A lot of times in brands we talk about archetypes. Some of you may be familiar with that. It goes back to Carl Jung and psychoanalysis, but these kind of iconic patterns of behavior that we have throughout history with people. You have them in literature and stories and characters, but brands are characters, right? And so it's that kind of essential question of what does that brand want to be? I kind of think of it as a deep philosophical question. That's the first phase of creating a good brand is deciding what is that character going to be? What does that brand want to be in terms of personality and stuff? So that's kind of the first kind of key thing to remember. And then secondly is this idea of the environment, or if we're talking about the environment, is where is this going to live? Really being able to balance those two things. I think a lot of times people get focused so much on what the brand character is, but they forget and lose sight of it has to live in the world, right? Who's your audience or your customers or consumers? And then what's the reality of the world that this is going to exist in, both now and in the future? I think sometimes too, thinking about trends as they come about and kind of trying to future proof your brand as much as you can a brand, because everything's always dynamically changing.
Well, can we talk about those characters there for a second? I got a question for you. So what are, let's say you're presented with a new brand, you've gotten the information about the product or the company itself. Like, what are some of the things that you're going to ask yourself when you start out, when you're kind of filling out that character, where you're like, is it a Homer Simpson or is it a Xena the warrior? So
yeah, I think the what is it? Is it Shakespeare to thine own self be true kind of thing? I think part of this is grounding it in the reality of the brand. If it's not an edgy brand, don't try to position, if that's not the kind of core of what that company or that product is about, the first thing I think is basing it in truth. What is the reality of what's the product or the service? But then also what's that aspiration? So it's kind of has to live in both worlds, because you don't want to promise something you can't deliver on. But at the same point, it should always be about the aspiration of a brand. A brand is never about reality. It's more about what could the world be like? What could, in the ideal situation. So it's always this kind of like, what I like about it is it's always this optimistic take on kind of the business, or optimistic take on the world. So I'd start first there of kind of like getting to know like what that company or product is, and then kind of basing it on the kind of reality of what they are, and then also what the aspiration is.
Where do you in that process typically intersect with a person like me? Like, where does strategy come into that decision-making process?
Good brands have that from the very beginning. I'd say that the brands that aren't as strong probably kind of try to either don't have that or kind of try to tack on design at the end. I think the best brands, and Kendra, like working with you, is like when we can work in conjunction, that's like where the magic happens, where it's both the way that the brand behaves and speaks and the strategy undergirding it is aligned with where the visuals take it. That's kind of where the magic happens. When there's a disconnect, the audience, we pick, even more and more nowadays, where we're all very brand savvy consumers, we can quickly detect when there's something that isn't aligned. So as much as the kind of the strategy and the design can kind of be intertwined early on, that leads to a much stronger brand in the long term.
I'm going to ask you more questions about sort of
Yeah.
the intersection of strategy and design as we go on, because I'm always curious as to how, my people in my position work best with you guys, on the visual end. But I'll let you keep talking about where it will live, the environment, before I cut
Yeah,
you off
yeah,
again.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, in terms of in the environment, and that's always something to get to know, like who the consumer is. There's the book Zig and Zag. It's also understanding this brand is not living in a void; it's living in the world. There are other products and services that also are competing for attention and dollars for brands. So part of the reality of that also is understanding kind of who the competition is. I mean, you could think of it like literally as the competitive set, but also kind of expanding beyond that. What are the other brands and things that compete for your audience's attention? And it could be a direct competitor. It also, I like to kind of use the hypothetical when I'm teaching that I've created an ice cream store and I'm creating a brand for it. Well, part of the competition is like another ice cream store, but it could also be the hamburger stand next door. It's
Mhm.
not directly competing, but it's still competing in terms of like if somebody's hungry, they're deciding between a hamburger and an ice cream. So kind of even expanding beyond like direct competitors to competitors that still are kind of vying for, your audience's attention. And then kind of looking also in terms of like larger trends that are happening in the
Mhm.
world. I think that's where kind of thinking about a brand, how a brand lives. It's not just. I think we're so busy in the making of brands, and I think that it's such a huge undertaking to create a brand and to do it really well, that everybody's usually focused on the creation of the brand, but there's also that idea of once it's made, it's kind of a living thing that has to be maintained and kind of curated over time. So this idea of like where will the brand live? It's like literally living in the world and how you kind of maintain it. From initial launch to the day to day to kind of weathering through whatever may come up in the future.